Oh, and we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 27 of the TechForge podcast. I'm your host for the evening, Ned, and I'm joined as always by my wonderful co-hosts, Jason and Hunter.
I want to sneeze, maybe. No, I'm not doing that.
So we got Walrus Jason.
Yes.
Walrus.
All right. So, CES, it's here. We've seen all the keynotes from the three major players. There's been lots of other tech besides, but today we're going to focus on the three keynotes from NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD, because otherwise we could be here for several hours going over some of all the cool and new and interesting stuff shown at CES this year.
Yeah.
And given this is a PC hardware-focused podcast, focusing on NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD lets us focus on what probably most of our audience considers important.
Mhm.
Although there are a couple of little minor things I want to talk about toward the end.
Oh.
So, technically, NVIDIA had their standard press conference the day before CES started. And so they announced a number of things there. And thankfully, AnonTech kept a running live blog of the NVIDIA keynote address where they discussed all the things that were revealed in order.
Sure.
And so I've linked the article. In fact, I've linked all the articles we're going to talk about tonight down below in the description. So please make sure to take a look at that link. They've all been collected into one nice little neat webpage for you using a wonderful service called OneTab.
It is nice.
Okay, so at the keynote, NVIDIA revealed a number of things about the future of RTX, as well as revealing a brand new product. Actually, multiple brand new products, but one that is really the focus of the evening, and that, of course, was the RTX 2060. Now, the RTX 2060 has some very interesting specifications. I mean, it was pretty much an open secret that they were going to announce the RTX 2060 right before CES. But it turns out pretty much all the specification leaks about the RTX 2060 were true. The Founders Edition model features 1,920 CUDA cores, 48 ROPS, a core clock of 1365 megahertz, but a maximum boost clock of 1680 megahertz. It is equipped with GDDR6. And the Founders Edition model, at least, is a 6 gigabyte VRAM frame buffer. Compared to its predecessor, the GTX 1060, it does pull a bit more power at 160 watts versus the GTX 1060's 120 watts. But it does feature RT and Tensor cores, which, of course, the GTX 1060 did not. And probably the most controversial thing about the RTX 2060 was its revealed MSRP, which was, again, in line with the leaks we talked about last week, of $349 USD.
Yeah.
And so
Yep.
there are a lot of the, at least a lot of the US tech press was able to get their hands on the RTX 2060 before CES to make sure that reviews were able to go live as soon as the card was revealed. This did cause a little bit of stir because there were a number of international outlets, in particular Hardware Unboxed and TechSpot, that did not receive samples in time, likely due to their less than glowing praise for the previous RTX products.
Yeah, unless you're a huge tech tuber like a Jays or a Linus, and I guess now you could kind of say Gamers Nexus. I mean, they've got a ton of followers now. Um, unless you've got a massive audience and reviewing stuff is kind of your shtick. If you've said anything even neutral about NVIDIA in the last few years, they kind of put you on the back burner.
Well, and several of those even big tech tubers have said some. Linus was pretty negative about all the RTX line.
Good.
Yeah, he's
And-
been negative.
That's because they're good parts. They're good performing parts, even though their main new feature sets aren't really offered in a whole lot of software right now. The bad thing about them is their ridiculous pricing.
Yeah.
And I saw the NVIDIA keynote, and the only cool thing about it was this little laser thing that Anantech's got to pick up. I mean, Jensen Huang was up there kind of hobbling around in his leather jacket. You know, he looks like a dried up potato. But and he unveiled the GTX 2060. Okay, cool. It's a cool part, but the problem is it's $350, man. And some of the tech tubers that are out there, some of the people that review these things are giving it praise because it's essentially a $350 1070 Ti. The problem is it's a 60 level part. It should not be $350. When the 1060 came out at $250, that was a little pricey, but okay. You know, you could get them between $250 and $300. I got mine at like, I don't know, $260 probably, $270 somewhere in there right before the GPUs just went crazy high in price. But if we think back to that 1060 launch, that whole Pascal launch was really good. The prices were not bad, right? Initially. But the 1060 was offering the same performance level as the 980. And the GTX 980 was a great part, but it MSRP'd, I want to say, at around $600 when it first came out. Now, when the 1060 came out, it was probably around $450 to $500. But then again, the 60 level part was advertised as giving you 980 performance for $250 MSRP. 60 level part. The 960 was a $200 part. And it was more of a value-oriented, low power part, right? But I want to say that it was offering performance around a 770 maybe when it came out. Maybe 780. 780 might be pushing it. And I mean, 1070 Ti is close enough to 1080, right? But still, they're justifying the pricing of the 2060 by saying that it's the same performance of a $400 to a $450 part currently. That's not the right way to go about this at all. It's beyond ridiculous. 60 level part, $250 MSRP. $350 MSRP, that is 70 level territory. Slightly below. 2070 should be $400, not $600 like it is. This entire lineup is beyond ridiculous.
Yeah,
they're bending gamers over, is what they're doing. Gamers are their bread and butter, and because of this, unfortunately, we get a great debut in a Radeon 7. Sorry, and it's at $700. All right, so shame on NVIDIA for this stuff, man. The one thing that I am glad about, though, with the 2060 launch is that they don't have 20 different product SKUs of 2060 yet. And I mean, by all means, it is good technology. I mean, these things are overclocking really high. Now, the reference PCBs are kind of odd, but did you see Gamers Nexus try to take it apart?
Oh yes, it is. It is almost hilariously over-engineered.
All these weird screws and all like
And
glue well over you.
yeah, and they glued some cable ribbon.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
the entire teardown that I watched for the RTX 2060 just demonstrated how hilariously over-engineered it is. Uh, I seriously think this is probably NVIDIA's first shot at making an in-house axial cooler. Because in the past, they've always used a blower style
Yeah.
that was fairly straightforward and then left the axial coolers to their add-in board partners.
Oh, some of their older reference designs. I mean, before the FX 5800, I want to say did have axial type fans on them, like the GeForce 4s and some of the FX lineup. Oh my gosh, that's going back.
Right, but that's 10 plus years ago. No, almost 15 years ago now.
Yeah, you're right. Wow.
Because 10 plus years ago, believe it or not, would have been the 8800 GT.
Yeah, it's true. But that was a blower style card too, though.
Yep.
Right?
In fact, pretty much all their high-end cards have been blower style up until this launch.
Yeah.
Now, some of the lower end parts would use single fanned axial coolers, but that was generally stuff that was in the 50 or 60 series.
Yeah, I don't remember what the 960 or the 760s looked like, honestly.
The 760 had a blower style cooler.
Oh, it did.
960, I had to go look it up.
Okay.
At least for the reference models.
Well, I'm getting off.
Well, the 960 still had a one fan and blower style. I don't know if it had the vapor chamber though.
Probably not.
I think the vapor chamber is the 10 series.
So, I linked AnonTech's live blog of the NVIDIA presser, but I also linked their review, and I really liked the way they put this one particular line.
What's that?
And so, well, it's more of a paragraph, but here's what they put. Generationally, the RTX 2060 does bring more to the table, offering roughly 86% of the performance of the RTX 2070 for 70% of the price. Or against its direct predecessor, the 1066 gig, it's faster by around 59%. In context, the 1060 was about 80 to 85% faster than the 960 at launch, where presently that gap is more along the lines of 2 times or more with the increased frame buffer of the primary driver. But at $200, the 960 was a true mainstream card, as was the 1060 at its $249 MSRP.
Mm-hmm.
What makes, now this is AnonTech, what makes the 350 pricing at least a bit more reasonable is its Radeon competition. Against RX Vega at its current prices, the RTX 2060 is near lethal. Reference to reference, though, the RTX 2060 is already around 95% of RX Vega 64. But of course, we know that, well, that's no longer the point of comparison, thanks to what AMD launched. The point being, the RTX 2060, the title of AnonTech's review brings it home really well. Not quite mainstream.
No, it's not mainstream at all.
And so I think one of two things is happening here. Either NVIDIA is wanting to push the 60 series out of being the mainstream card and pull in the 50 series to replace it, or if all the rumors about an 11 series that we've been hearing is indeed true, that the 1160 is going to become the new mainstream card.
Which, if that comes out with somewhere between a $200 to $250, MSRP, and it offers some pretty decent performance, okay, I'd be all right with that. You know what I mean?
But I think the existence of an 1160 is the less likely of the two futures. And here's why. If NVIDIA releases a GTX 1160 without RT and Tensor cores, but with the same gaming performance as a GTX 2060, or even slightly gimped performance compared to the 2060, they will eviscerate their own sales of the 2060.
Well, they are masters of the supply channel.
Yeah, and that's why they're getting sued. But
but if they come out with the 1160 sometime after everybody's bought the 2060, then they'll still get money from the 2060.
Yeah, but at the same time, it would be pulling the same move they did with the 1070 Ti against the 1080.
True.
The 1070 Ti rendered the GTX 1080 irrelevant. In fact, the only reason NVIDIA was able to continue to sell 1080s was because they specifically kept their add-in board partners from overclocking the 1070 Ti's.
Yeah.
Which any enthusiast with a few minutes of know-how and the willingness to overclock could easily overclock the 1070 Ti to 1080 levels or higher.
Well, even Jay from Jay's 2 Cents said that I can't overclock it, but that doesn't mean you can't.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In fact, in one of his videos, he showed off EVGA had an auto overclocking variant of their software that essentially just performed a stock overclock. It scanned the card and applied an overclock automatically after 15 to 30 minutes of its own testing. So,
and essentially NVIDIA also, as part of the keynote, has released almost the same thing with their Scanner OC software.
Yeah.
And the way the boost algorithms work anymore, as long as you've got enough cooling and power delivery, they'll auto overclock themselves pretty high, almost 2 gigahertz in some cases. And that's almost any of the 60 level parts and up. So, but still, man, I'm just so fed up with RTX and the tax.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It is the RTX tax.
Yeah, I'd rather buy 1160 if I was going to buy another NVIDIA card.
And at this point, given what we've seen of how ray tracing has been implemented, right now, I don't think RTX makes any sense. Whether you're talking about the technology or you're talking about the cards.
It really doesn't. I'm still not sure why NVIDIA has released this line of cards, or at least with this feature set. I mean, AMD still has their ray tracing technology and development. So I don't know.
Well,
it's the search for the next big thing. They're trying to push the next big thing to the cards so people will buy their cards, their new cards.
Right, because
they always the search for the next big thing.
On the one hand, I think there's one thing way back in the original RTX launch keynote that Jensen got right, and that is rasterization is tapped out. there's not that much more we can do with rasterization to improve fidelity.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
right.
at this point, you have to do something else. Now,
Yeah.
ray tracing as a technology when it comes to graphics rendering is one of the original forms of rendering. The reason it hasn't been used and that rasterization has been so popular for years is because ray tracing is computationally expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Extremely computationally expensive. And so, to be able to implement real-time ray tracing requires specialized hardware. The problem right now is the hardware we have is first-generation hardware, which means not very good.
Yeah.
Well, I have, and like I said, I have no problem with the technology. I think it's interesting and cool. My problem is the pricing. Pricing's ridiculous. So,
And I agree. Essentially, what NVIDIA is asking consumers to do is to take a gamble on their ray tracing implementation being widely implemented by developers based on nothing so far but a lackluster implementation in Battlefield 5 and vague promises from about a half dozen other developers. And given what we've seen of DXR performance in Battlefield 5, where enabling it in any capacity basically cuts your frame rate in half, no matter what settings you're running at, and no matter what hardware you're running at, even if you're running an RTX 2080 Ti, for what is at best a bunch of very pretty reflections.
Yeah.
well, in some cases, your performance is neutered by as much as 66%, man.
So really, you'd have to SLI 2 cards just to make up the frame difference.
And that's assuming the game that you're running even implements SLI.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to
Sounds
think
like they
about it,
shot themselves in the foot with this.
Well,
cost to SLI 2070 is $1,200 easy.
Yeah.
and at
Or
that
more.
point, you might as well get a 2080 Ti.
Yeah.
You know,
And
it's so bad I can't recommend RTX to anybody.
I think what we're witnessing is NVIDIA that knows that they don't have any really close competition at the super high end, knowing that they can basically use these higher prices from this first generation of RTX cards to subsidize improvement of the technology. What we're seeing is NVIDIA attempting to play the long game. You know, people laughed at AMD with their quote-unquote fine wine technology. And the idea that over time they would take the technology in their GC and architecture and refine it to the point where it was something really incredible. But they did.
Look at Vega and RX 580 benchmarks now versus when those cards came out. Vega 56 benchmarks are between 25 to 35% better.
Yeah, I saw a video today of the Vega 64 is actually better than the 2070. I don't know if it's with ray tracing on or off, though.
Probably off.
Probably.
Yeah.
And what I think we're seeing happen is NVIDIA knows that they had to have a generation where the technology is not quite up to snuff just to get it out there and to get it into people's hands and to put in an install base large enough to justify strong-arming developers into including ray tracing technology.
My opinions are a little different on pricing, though. I think the biggest reason the RTX cards are so expensive is I just lost my thought, but is mainly because they still had a lot of Pascal left over, and they're essentially competing with Pascal. So,
yeah, sounds.
Yeah, there's an argument to be made that they intentionally made the prices high so that they could force the remainder of Pascal out of the sales channel. But I don't know. I think this is NVIDIA attempting to subsidize RTX and Tensor cores. Or maybe we're all overthinking this. Maybe this is just NVIDIA saying, you know what? Instead of producing a gaming line and a line of production GPUs, we just take the production GPUs, chop them down, and call them gaming cards.
huh. But the thing is, they're not that good. If you're saying strictly compute, there's better priced options across the fence, man. Look at Vega. Perfectly fine in compute. Much cheaper. I don't know.
Again, I'd agree, but I'm just trying to look at this from NVIDIA's perspective.
Mm.
And speaking of looking across the fence, apparently NVIDIA decided that not supporting adaptive sync in the VESA standard outside of their own extremely complicated and very expensive G-Sync, that eventually they were going to have to support adaptive sync themselves. And so NVIDIA, as part of their keynote, announced VESA adaptive sync support. They were very careful not to use FreeSync as the name.
Yep.
Through their G-Sync compatible monitors program. Now, on the one hand, this is a blatant marketing move, right? This is we've known that NVIDIA GPUs can support the VESA adaptive sync standard for years, and the reason we know this is because that's how they did G-Sync in laptops. Was that they essentially included in the mobile laptop driver a implementation of adaptive sync, FreeSync, so that they wouldn't have to have an expensive G-Sync module in their laptop monitors.
Actually, that I didn't know.
Yeah, they have been doing it for years. They just have not been saying a whole lot about it.
Well, this type of move was coming. I mean, FreeSync more than owns the lion's share of the adaptive sync market, and you can thank their console sales for that. You know, it's in TVs, monitors, all kinds of stuff now.
And so, in that regard, I think this was kind of inevitable.
I agree.
But something Adored TV pointed out in his coverage about the NVIDIA keynote, and something I hadn't thought about till he mentioned it. This is essentially NVIDIA playing quality control for FreeSync.
Yeah.
Because they are taking these FreeSync monitors and they're picking the very best ones, in their opinion, and marking them as G-Sync compatible.
Yep.
And that's good in one sense, in that tells us, okay, these are probably some of the very best FreeSync panels out there. But on the other hand, what a missed opportunity for AMD. if AMD had had some kind of FreeSync certification program out there years ago, and it had to force NVIDIA to play to their tune instead of NVIDIA now kind of forcing AMD to play to theirs.
Yeah. Well, that's been one of AMD's Achilles heels with their GPU marketing, is they've just been absolutely horrid with it. You know, they'll spend cycles and money on marketing just to get rid of the brand in the next lineup. There's no more Fury cards, for example. There's no Radeon HDs, for example. Polaris has got a very good brand right now because it's cheap and it's fast. You know, even though Vega is, from a branding perspective, is kind of tarnished, they could still stick with it because it does have a loyal following. It's probably kind of a minority, but. And then you look at GeForce. GeForce is a solid brand because NVIDIA is just simply stuck with it. They've had bad products, but they always come back. And that's been one of AMD's biggest Achilles heel or weaknesses when it comes to mindshare is branding. They got it right with Ryzen. They've hit it out of the park with Ryzen, but not with Radeon. Not with Radeon. They need to follow what they've done with Ryzen and use that within Radeon and do better with branding and mindshare. But yeah, you're right.
And there was one thing toward the end of their announcement about G-Sync compatible, which I thought was a nifty little coup on their part. Quote, for variable refresh rate monitors yet to be validated as G-Sync compatible, a new NVIDIA control panel option will enable owners to try and switch the tech on. It may work partly, or it may not work at all. And so you'll notice by saying it in this way, they're not saying, well, the problem is technically with our driver, because that's what the reality is. What they're saying is, well, the problem is with the monitor. And you have to go to the monitor manufacturers to fix it.
So it's your fault, not theirs.
Exactly.
That sounds familiar, Apple.
It's an impressive little bit of marketing judo there.
That is impressive.
The problem isn't our product and our implementation of G-Sync as it interfaces with Phase's Adaptive Sync standard. The problem is you just picked the wrong monitor.
Wow.
Which Gordon Maung from PC World showed a video where, yes, there are some panels that have some weird issues with both FreeSync and with G-Sync through this method.
Yeah,
that's more down. That's more down to panel manufacturers kind of skating on what was on the very edge of the FreeSync standard.
Just to shave a few bucks. Yeah, he was showing that on a curved monitor, which actually on the surface looked pretty good.
And so they also announced RTX laptops, but they didn't really say a whole lot about them other than there were going to be lots of gaming laptops in the near future featuring RTX mobile cards. Now, whether those are going to be like Max-Q cards like they were last generation or not, we don't know. Not that much was said.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because RTX is pretty power hungry compared to Pascal. So,
well, either way, I think we'll probably see RTX laptops in the near future, and there were several manufacturers who were already showing off upcoming laptops that featured RTX graphics cards. I know Alienware in particular had their new Area 51M, which has a custom, which features an RTX 2080 Ti custom modified to fit in the MXM standard. Because remember, NVIDIA dropped MXM as a standard. And so Dell basically went in with their Alienware partners and said, you know what? If you're not going to do it, NVIDIA, we'll do it ourselves.
It's too bad, really. That was an interesting idea. It's kind of sad when that didn't really take off and get supported.
Yeah, the MXM standard could have really made things, at least for end users, far more interesting to be able to manually upgrade your graphics card while still staying with the same CPU.
Mm-hmm.
Which I know that would have only appealed to a very niche market, but man, that would have been nice.
It would have. It would have allowed you to upgrade and be really flexible with your laptop platform.
I mean, I have a laptop. It's about 5 years old now. It has a Core i7-4702MQ, which is still a solid processor. Quad core, 8-thread, runs between 2.2 and 3.6 gigahertz. Basically built on Haswell architecture. Perfectly serviceable CPU for a laptop. The problem is it's shackled to a GT750M, which was not a bad entry-level graphics card at the time, but that these days is really starting to show its limits.
Yeah, because the M cards or M chips were like a cut down previous gen desktop GPU.
Right.
I remember those because I had a 96, I think it was a 950 or 960 M in a laptop I had, and it could barely run Minecraft. Of course, Minecraft is also memory hungry, but it could barely run games that I ran on my desktop.
Yeah, my GT750M, right after Fallout 4 came out, I tried to run Fallout 4 on that machine. Fallout 4 is not a fun time when you're running at 22 FPS on low.
Oh, yeah, on low.
Ooh, that's gross.
Well, I was in the middle of rebuilding my desktop at the time, and I didn't have a whole lot of choice.
Completely understand.
It sounds like you're watching yourself go.
Yeah, I'm going to date myself here, but if you ever watched those episodes of The $6 Million Man where they intentionally slow things down frame by frame whenever he's doing something that's supposed to be amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what playing Fallout 4 was like.
Oh, that's the same way it was for me. I think I was playing Rust on my laptop just to see if it could run it, and it was basically like that. I was dead in 5 seconds and didn't know it until a couple minutes later when the frames caught up. So yeah. That's a fun time is when either it's the internet is the cause, internet speed, or it's the graphics power is you dead and you don't even know it until a couple minutes later.
Which the funny thing is, the GT750M that I was using was not a terrible card. There were games it would run just fine. I could play CS:GO at decent frame rates on it. I used to play Dirty Bomb a lot, which was kind of a fun game, very CS:GO-like. It was like a hybrid between TF2 CS:GO and kind of the hero shooter that Overwatch spawned. But
yeah.
But there were games it would run just fine. But AAA titles it really struggled with.
Yeah.
But we were talking about NVIDIA. One last little bit about NVIDIA, and this wasn't from their keynote directly, but apparently their CEO, Jensen Huang, when he was being interviewed later in the show, was feeling his oats a bit and called the launch of the Radeon 7, which we'll talk about here in a little while, from AMD, quote, underwhelming.
Yeah. Well, he's always going to do that. He's always going to be a staunch defender of his own product. They've always been like that.
Yeah.
Well, that isn't as far as he went. He said, quote, it's underwhelming, the performance is lousy, and there's nothing new. There's no ray tracing, no AI. It's 7 nanometer with HBM memory that barely keeps up with the 2080. And if we turn on DLSS, we'll crush it. And if we turn on ray tracing, we'll crush it. But I love the next line in the PC World article. It says, of course, this is all conjecture, as there's no way Mr. Huang could know how the Radeon 7 actually performs since it's not available yet. So, good job, PC World and Gordon Maung for calling out Jensen Huang.
Yep. That's why we love Gordon Maung.
So, the next big keynote that was at CES this year was Intel's. And I had to go through and rewatch this to actually figure out what exactly it is they launched. Because the answer to that is nothing. They announced a lot of things. They didn't actually launch anything.
Well,
yeah.
But in fairness, there were a number of things that Intel talked about in their keynote. And the very first thing they opened up with was on the consumer market, they announced Ice Lake. Now, Ice Lake is what we've been waiting on to be the successor to Coffee Lake.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, they didn't announce desktop CPUs. Instead, Ice Lake apparently is going to premiere as a mobile part.
Didn't they do the same with 14 nanometer with Broadwell? Didn't they announce that first as a mobile part? This kind of feels the same.
I'd have to go back to be sure.
Because they were having all kinds of trouble.
Yeah, because Broadwell, there is a mobile part of Broadwell.
Right.
Well, they had more mobile parts than they had desktop parts.
Right, because by the time Broadwell actually made it to market, it was already like 3 years behind.
Yep.
Or well, no, that's not accurate. It's more like 2 years behind. Because it was originally, Broadwell was supposed to be launching in 2014, and it didn't launch till almost the very tail end of 2015. Because Haswell was supposed to come in 2013, and it did, but then instead in early 2014, Broadwell coming out, we had the Haswell refresh about halfway through 2014, with Broadwell coming out toward the end of 2015. Or toward the end of 2014, beginning of 2015.
That Devil's Canyon implementation is one of the best they've had in recent years. Putting the soldered TIM in there.
And then, of course, in 2015, we had Skylake, and pretty much all the implementations since then have been iterations on Skylake.
Mm-hmm.
Skylake, Cabby Lake, Coffee Lake Refresh.
Just put a plus every time they make a refresh or whatever.
And admittedly, they're still calling it Lake, but these processors apparently are based on a new CPU microarchitecture called Sunny Cove. and will be natively designed for 10 nanometer.
Oh, good.
And so Ice Lake is taking what they're calling a 4+2 configuration for notebooks.
So it's like that stack configuration that they showed off earlier.
Well, actually, that's Lakefield, but we'll get to that in just a minute. But they call it 4+2 because it's going to combine a 4-core, 8-thread CPU with their GT2 graphics processor based on their Gen 11 graphics microarchitecture. And apparently they're going to fit this 4-core, 8-thread CPU and this GT2 internal integrated GPU with 64 execution units in a 15-watt TDP.
It's pretty impressive.
And apparently it's going to be equipped with LPDDR4X RAM.
So low power DDR4.
Apparently, though, the X means it's going to be running at higher memory bandwidth, apparently with a 3200 megahertz specification.
Okay.
With up to 60 gigabits per second of memory bandwidth, and it will support Thunderbolt 3 over USB Type-C.
Mm-hmm. I don't know about that. That's interesting.
But you're right to talk about the stacked die design, because that was one of the other things they talked about. This technology called Foveros is the thing where they're able to stack different CPU dies as well as I/O dies, memory, and other technology onto a substrate that essentially acts as, well, interposer isn't really the right word, but it essentially acts as a bridge holding all this stuff together. And they're calling this technology Foveros. We talked about this before, but they showed Lakefield, which is their very first chip that shows this technology in action. Lakefield apparently features a single Sunny Cove CPU core with 4 smaller Atom cores. I don't think they specified which CPU architecture it was using. Most likely it's probably using some variant of their upcoming Tremont architecture.
Oh, that's right. I think we talked about this, where they are
the
almost
hybrid,
taking, like an ARM, a current ARM design approach almost.
right? A big not little approach.
Yeah.
So having a single big core for bursty workloads, and then 4 smaller cores to handle the low-level tasks that don't necessarily need that kind of speed.
That's right. You like your bursty, Ned. That's right.
And so basically this is Intel's attempt to combat ARM using the technology that they have available. And they showed a demo of Lakefield. Apparently, this particular CPU that they demonstrated was roughly in the 7-watt range, but they said it could be scaled down to as low as 2 milliwatts idle power draw. And they also talked about a low-powered chip that apparently offered higher performance but lower power draw than even the A12X chips in the Apple iPads.
Okay. Well, when they start talking actual desktop performance processors, I'll be interested. I mean, this stuff looks interesting and it's great tech, but I don't know. It's hard to get super enthusiastic about it. Now, the Foveros approach is kind of interesting because it almost hints at some efficient modular type design, I think. But
one would almost dare to call them chiplets.
yeah. Yep. And I know we're going to be getting there pretty soon.
But yeah, the Foveros 3D active interposer technology. I guess interposer was the word I was looking for before. They're calling it a 3D active interposer technology that allows them to stack not only the CPU dies, like we mentioned, with all the I/O and whatnot, but they're also able to stack additional dies containing RAM on top of it, so that the CPU cores have almost direct access to memory without having to go through an I/O bus.
Yeah. Well, and you know, the GPU core as well. So kind of makes you wonder how heat is transferred.
You know, that would be something very interesting.
Yeah, actually.
And so they also announced, we talked about them last week, so I won't go into a lot of detail, the new F-series processors, the 9900KF, the 9700KF, the 9600KF, the 9400F, which basically are identical to their non-F counterparts, except they do not have an onboard integrated graphics processor. The only one that
is it still there, but it's just
they didn't go into any detail. They just said that it would not have an active integrated graphics processor versus their non-F counterparts.
Right. Okay.
The one that's interesting to me is the 9400F, because up to this point we have not received an i5 9400, which supposedly would be the successor to the 8400. Apparently the 9400 is basically identical to the 8400, except the base and boost clocks both got bumped up by 100 megahertz.
Okay. So
it's still a 6-core, 6-thread part. It's just now it's running about 2.9 gigahertz instead of 2.8.
2.9 with like what, a 4 gigahertz boost?
I think it's 4.1, but
okay. That wouldn't be a bad budget option. Doubt you could get it for the same price as a 2600 though.
So they also talked about some data center stuff, which is probably less relevant to our audience, but they did talk about Cascade Lake, that they are working on getting Cascade Lake out into the channel. We've talked about Cascade Lake before, which
Xeon, right?
Which is Xeon, mostly designed for the server market. The full retail launch of Cascade Lake is, quote, sometime in 2019.
Okay.
They also announced a couple of other new technologies, like their Nirvana, and that's Nervana, which is basically their AI platform for neural networks and neural network acceleration. They announced a new SoC for mobile called Snow Ridge. They're mostly focused on networking and targeting 5G mobile deployments. And finally, they discussed a future Ice Lake Xeon built on 10 nanometer that they called Ice Lake Xeon Scalable. So basically, they're thinking of doing the same thing they did with Cascade Lake, where they essentially put multiple dies on the same interposer, and doing that with 10 nanometer, which, given that they're experimenting already with Foveros and Lakefield, would not surprise me at all.
So cool tech, but is it just me or is it hard to follow all of these code names?
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
There's there's a lot more than we typically get. Normally we have about 2, maybe 1. That's a lot of code names.
But you'll notice a lot of them are, this is what we're going to be doing. There's almost nothing announced that was, we have this today, or this is ready to launch today.
Right.
And I think that's very telling for Intel.
Well, they're still having trouble with 10 nanometer. They've invested in it, so they'll eventually come out with something. I wonder if we'll see maybe a trickle of 10 nanometer parts and then they just immediately move to 7.
Well, I don't know for sure. The one thing that was kind of interesting about Lakefield is they showed a Lakefield, essentially a Lakefield mainboard that was roughly the size of 5 quarters.
Thank you.
And so I'm thinking if Lakefield could make its way into, say, we remember a few years ago the Intel Compute Stick, right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I remember that.
The HDMI Compute Stick? Or the oh man.
The one that you can stick in the back of your TV and have a full-fledged Windows 10 experience.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so to have I could see Lakefield, something that size, basically the size of 5 quarters, going into something like a Compute Stick style, a Compute Stick style computer, or even going into like a small ultra thin laptop.
Yeah. I mean, there's markets for that kind of stuff. I mean, like, mainly office systems, like conference rooms that want to have a desktop connected directly to like a big display. Like you walk in, there's a conference room, there's a table, you've got a wireless keyboard and mouse set up right there. All you do is log into your Active Directory account, and then boom, it pulls your profile down, and you know what I mean, like that kind of stuff. Or maybe a TV computer where you're streaming stuff to it. So there are valid use cases for that stuff.
Oh, and I almost forgot. Intel also announced a number of technology innovations with their Project Athena, which is designed to look at AI learning, and also some automotive investments that they've made and that they're looking to include for, in particular, they showed their Mobileye technology, which they're partnering with the Beijing Public Transportation Corporation to basically help take China's public transit and make it autonomous.
Interesting.
So, I mean, again, these are all interesting technologies, but there wasn't a lot to show. They did show Lakefield running in a few small devices. In particular, they mentioned that they want to look at new 11-inch laptop designs that are, thinner, faster, sleeker, smarter. But again, there wasn't a lot of these were announcements for things that are at the very least 6 months to a year out.
Well, it kind of shows you the effect that Ryzen has had on them and their lack of the manufacturing capacity to keep up with their own demand.
So this year's CES to me was full of underwhelming keynotes. But Intel's by far was the most underwhelming for me.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the third and final keynote we'll be discussing this evening, and the one that I think caused the most stir, and that was AMD's.
Yep.
Well, there was a lot of hype going into it.
There was a lot of hype going into it, and there were some of the things in that hype that did appear, others that were hinted and teased at, but almost none of which were confirmed.
Yeah, I think in a few ways it was more revealing than I think we actually realized. And there was one move that was very controversial.
Yes, I would agree. And so, looking again at the live blog and also some of the summary articles, of course, when I was watching the keynote live, the thing I noted was that AMD kind of slow rolled this whole thing. This was their first keynote, and they spent like the first 20 minutes or so just talking about how they got to this point over the last couple of years, which is fine. I mean, in any keynote, you want to acknowledge how you got to where you are. But it seemed like they took longer than really necessary.
And they talked about mobile first.
Yeah, they did talk about mobile first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, technically, they talked about Threadripper first. But and they had that bit from the Fox VFX lab where they talked about how much Threadripper improved their workflow and
oh yeah, that's right, like the production company or whatever. Yeah,
right, and that was neat to see. But
that
again,
was actually kind of cool.
But again, it's the kind of standard marketing speak you'd expect.
Yeah.
Here's this one client of ours that really saw an improvement from using our product. But then you're right. They then went into mobile. They had already announced Ryzen Mobile, which they're calling them Ryzen 3000 parts, but they're built on second-gen Ryzen. So these are Zen Plus parts, not Zen 2 parts.
Right.
Keep that in mind. They did mention that the second-generation AMD Ryzen mobile processors showed, quote, 14% quicker web page loading and 27% faster video editing.
Yeah, but I think that wasn't that compared to some Intel variants. I don't remember.
Yeah, they don't list, at least in this slide deck that I'm looking at, I don't see the list of what exactly they were comparing it to. But, again, standard marketing speak. They claimed up to 12 hours of battery life in an ultra-thin form factor with discrete level graphics performance, which, based on what we know about AMD's APU design, is believable.
Yeah.
But you're probably not going to get those at the same time.
No, you need it. You need it plugged in. It needs to be operating on wall power. If you're looking purely at performance aesthetic in a mobile setting with Ryzen and Vega cores and parts, you need to have that stuff plugged in. It'll perform pretty well on the battery, but that would be one laptop I would definitely consider getting. Would be a Ryzen.
I seriously consider pulling the trigger on a just as an everyday usage laptop, a Ryzen 5 2500U system about this time last year. Or, well, it would have been right after the 2500U launched.
Okay.
Probably closer to March-ish, but...
Well, you wouldn't have been giving up too much to the 2700U, honestly.
No. Probably the biggest deal for mobile, though, was that AMD announced that Ryzen Mobile driver support directly through Radeon software was going to be implemented starting next month in February 2019, which is a big deal because getting driver updates for your Ryzen Mobile CPUs and APUs has been a pain, which is one of the key reasons why I didn't get one.
I'm kind of surprised by that they didn't do that in the first place.
Surprised me too, but then there was a section where they had the Bronx Science School come on and talk about how they used AMD processors and AMD computers in the classroom. AMD showed off their first ever Chromebooks.
Really?
Yep. And that's when they went into the gaming section. And they talked a lot about gaming. And in a move that surprised me, they brought Phil Spencer of Microsoft onto the stage to talk about the successor to the Xbox One, which, of course, AMD is designing that chip.
Yeah, but not just with Microsoft, though, with Sony as well. Sony's paid a lot of that R&D.
But they talked about how you're able to play Xbox and Xbox 360 games on the Xbox One, thanks to some custom chip work that AMD did for Microsoft and yada, yada, yada. But that's not what we're here to talk about. And so then they went into the PC gamer sections where they talked about their recent RX 590 launch and about how FreeSync is the -- 1 adaptive sync ecosystem, mostly because it's free.
Yep. Yeah, it's because it's free in the consoles.
Yeah. And they talked about how their Radeon software had improved over the course of 2018 into 2019.
Which it has, actually.
Yeah, they claim that Radeon Software Adrenaline 2019 versus its 2018 counterpart features 15% better game performance overall and includes 23 new or highly enhanced features.
Well, just the fan curve is amazing.
But of course, the thing that everybody took note of, and the thing that was probably the highlight of the announcement, or of the keynote, was the announcement and the release date of the new Vega 2 powered Radeon 7.
This was very controversial by them.
Oh, yeah.
So Radeon 7, as they've taken to calling it, although they demark it with VII, Roman numerals, but still hearkening back to the Vega branding a bit.
Hey, it's 7 nanometers. Let's just call it Vega, like Radeon 7.
Well, we talked about it about a month ago now, how one of AMD's top CEOs apparently was pushing Radeon 7 as an initiative until he abruptly left in the middle of last month. So this may have been a legacy project. But it is the world's first gaming GPU built on a 7-nanometer architecture. And so the Radeon 7 name, yeah, it's kind of cutesy, but it works. And the fact that they are able to represent it as VII, hearkening back to the fact that it is the second iteration of Vega, doesn't hurt either.
Well, there's a couple of interesting takeaways from this Radeon 7 this Vega 7 nanometer. It's not just simply moving, Vega down to 7 nanometers. They've kind of tweaked it a little bit. You've got 4 stacks of HBM2 memory, which give you double the bandwidth of current Vega. And that alone, that's huge. But the other little bit is this has 120 ROPs on it versus 64 or 60-ish from standard Vega 64 or Vega 56, which that's responsible for the very last part of the rendering pipeline. So I don't know if there were bottlenecks in current Vega, but that's kind of big too. So that tells me that this card was pretty much made for gaming. So these things will perform extremely well. And power-wise, they're not going to be that bad. Power envelope is pretty decent.
Well,
about the level of performance.
Yeah, and Lisa Sue was able to bring an example up on stage and show it. I've got a couple of pictures here that I'll share real quick. And present to everyone. And so you can see here, they have some up-close pictures here. This is from a non-tech of the GPU itself. Notice it's a triple fan axial design. You got the cute little red R there that they had from Vega.
I do really like this reference cooler design.
Yeah, I'm a fan as well.
Looks really good.
And in particular, this GPU will have 60 compute units, which is technically 4 less than original Vega, but or original Vega 64, but they're claiming 25% better performance at the same power, meaning this will probably draw similar power to Vega 64, but perform around 25% better.
Well, it kind of makes sense. I mean, huge increase in performance from the node, plus twice the memory bandwidth, plus twice the number of restoration processors, plus clock speed. So they'll have a few hundred megahertz of clock speed as well.
And higher boost speed.
Yep.
In addition, like you said, a 1.8 gigahertz boost clock, which 1.8 gigahertz is roughly on par with what Pascal and Turing are doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think Pascal and Turing are able to do a little higher on some of their boost clocks, but it's easily right there. It's easily right there.
I mean, the official rating is, like RTX 2060 we talked about earlier. Officially, the boost clock is 1680 megahertz, but we know it'll go higher than that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So Vega, the Radeon 7 also features 16 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory. They didn't specifically say it was HBM2, but it's probably HBM2.
It's HBM2.
And they claim memory bandwidth of up to 1 terabyte per second.
Yeah, that's pretty insane, man. That's pretty insane. Because reference Vega is around 500 something bits, or I forget exactly what it is.
Vega 64s is a 483.8 gigabits per second memory bandwidth.
Well, you can overclock Vega 64 pretty easily, and you can easily get it over 500.
They then showed some benchmarks, which, again, these are their own internal benchmark numbers, so take them with the grain of salt, because Well, you should any numbers provided by the manufacturer. They claim 27% faster render over Vega 64 in Blender and DaVinci Resolve, 29% faster in Adobe Premiere, and up to 62% faster in OpenCL applications.
Which is not bad. That's really good.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to wait and see what the reviewers say here in about a month.
Right, because it is coming out on February 7th.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike with the original Vega launch, where they focused mostly on compute performance at first, this time with Radeon 7, they specifically mentioned gaming and pointed out that compared to Vega 64, Radeon 7 is, and this is again their internal benchmarks, 35% faster than in Battlefield 5, 25% faster in Fortnite, and 42% faster in Strange Brigade.
Mm.
Which, Battlefield 5 is an NVIDIA title. Fortnite is mostly neutral, but generally runs better on NVIDIA hardware. And Strange Brigade is an AMD-sponsored title that uses Vulkan.
Well, Battlefield 5 has done pretty well on AMD hardware, though.
It has, but it was NVIDIA-sponsored, unlike Battlefield 1, which was AMD-sponsored.
Gotcha.
They also showed a demo of Battlefield 5, Devil May Cry 5, at 4K max settings. They didn't go into any more detail about what that meant, but it was achieving between 70 and 110 FPS per second on Radeon 7.
Nice.
They say it is... Go ahead.
That was really impressive. Be 4K and doing 110 FPS. That's pretty awesome.
Of course, again, we don't have anything to compare that to at this point. We don't know what the exact settings were, yada, yada, yada. They did show that it's roughly on par with the RTX 2080. I'm hopping over here to an article by TechSpot. Turns out if you look at the press release materials from AMD, there's a lot more benchmarks that didn't make it into the slide deck. And they compare Radeon 7 to an RX Vega 64, and I think they have in total 25 different benchmarks that they ran.
Nice.
And on average, Radeon 7 was 28.59% faster, or 28.59% higher FPS in the benchmarks they ran.
Which is pretty good.
And so I thought that was interesting.
Well, Fallout 4 is a 68%. It's pretty insane. Or Fallout 76. Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive. Of course, admittedly, as a Fallout fan, Fallout 76 is a buggy mess of game. So I don't know how much that really says.
Oh, I don't know.
I mean, considering that you have to go in and change an INI file to turn off VSync.
Oh, you do?
Yep.
That's kind of bad.
Well, it's because originally the Fallout creation engine, if you go higher than 60 frames per second, the physics start getting really wonky.
Oh, really?
Because originally the physics engine was tied to frame rate. Anyway, there's lots of information we've included links to for the Radeon 7.
Well, I think a couple of takeaways from this. This is the first bona fide 4K gaming card for NVIDIA, but it's also the first $700 like consumer level video card buying it. Did I say video?
You did.
Yeah,
AMD.
you did.
I'm tired, guys. It's the first bona fide 4K gaming card from AMD, but it's also the first $700 consumer end, video card by AMD. So not too crazy about the price, but Vega actually is really good tech. It's very good tech. So,
well, if it's any consolation, at launch, the Radeon 7 is going to be bundled with 3 games. Those 3 games are Devil May Cry 5, The Division 2, and the remastering of Resident Evil 2.
which I'm looking very forward to getting that one.
And so that's,
Resident Evil remaster looks really good.
I mean, that's going to be roughly, what, $150 to $180 worth of games?
Yeah.
So if you take that into account, yes, it's still $6.99, but after you take away the value in games, you're looking at around a, what, $550 card?
Roughly. Yeah.
So if you want to look at it that way, you are getting some value at least. Of course, right now, technically, the RTX 2060 is going to be launching with a bundle where you get either a free copy of Anthem or Battlefield 5. And I think there's a bundle right now with the RTX 2080 where you can get both. But again, that's about $650. Gentlemen, you'll have to pardon me for just a moment.
No problem.
Continue.
Well, I don't know if we really need to cover too much more with the Radeon side of things. I think we've pretty well beaten that up. I think for me, the most interesting aspect of the keynote, yeah, the Vega part was interesting, but it was the Ryzen benchmark where they showed. So they had the i9 9900K, right? And it was running Cinebench R15.
Yeah.
And then they had a Ryzen part, which I believe all they said was 8-core 16 thread. And it pretty much beat it. I mean, it wasn't a trouncing, but it showed that with the next generation of Ryzen or Zen 2, Ryzen 3 technically, that it was able to actually outperform i9 9900K for significantly less power draw.
Yep.
And when Lisa showed what the actual chip looked like underneath the heat spreader, they showed the IO die in one chiplet. So there was a lot of room still left on the I don't know what you'd call it.
I've got a picture of the CPU here that I'll be happy to show. And so you can see here in this picture from AnonTech that they're sharing here, there's a very clear space right here underneath. This is the Zen 2 die, this one right here. And this is the IO die. You'll notice there's a very clear spot on the CPU where there could be a second Zen 2 die. And if you look really closely at that photo, you will notice that there is a place where some contacts have been painted over.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah,
go ahead.
If I zoom in here, notice right here and right here.
Yep.
There's very clearly something there that's been painted. It's even more obvious. There was a video, again, where Gordon Mahon did. There's a very there's a video where it's even more obvious due to the way the light is reflected from the camera. But if I could find a picture of that, I would.
I saw a video of him talking to WCCF Tech. I forgot the guy's name.
Keith May.
Keith. Where they were talking about they have that one 8-core 16-thread die, and they could have another one below it to make it a 16-core chip.
Which
so possibly they'll see that. Yeah.
Which would put it in line with the leak
of
the Ryzen 9s, right?
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if people really appreciate the power of this type of design. So when you've got separate modules like that, as they're calling them chiplets, that affords you a lot of flexibility. You know, if you wanted to put a different I/O in there, you could easily put a different I/O in there. If you wanted to, and also what those chiplets allow them to do is bin easier, because they don't have monolithic designs. They can use smaller amounts of silicone and potentially bin more defect-free silicone for their chips. So I'm very, very excited about this design. Sorry, my brain's kind of shutting off.
It's okay. I was going to try and see if I could find this video of Gordon Maung as he's messing around with Ryzen 3. Okay, hold on. I might be able to pull it up here because he was able to get hands-on with Ryzen 3.
Okay.
Here it is. Okay. Let me share this. Whoa. Wrong screen share. So let me present to everyone. Let's see. Okay. This is what I was wanting to draw attention to, was this point right here. Notice when... Yeah, let me see if I can...
So the contacts are painted over, you're saying?
There's a point in the video where it's very plainly obvious. Let's see. I'm trying to remember where right there.
There we go.
Ah.
Yep.
You see, there is very definitely a set of contacts there that have been painted over.
Looks like the same size as the 8-core die. Or chiplet.
Yep.
Exactly. And my thinking is we could definitely see a second Zen 2 die there, or if the leaks about a APU are true, we could see maybe a Vega die put there.
That would be a pretty big Vega die, actually.
And so that's why I wanted to share that particular video, because right there at that point in the video, it becomes very plainly obvious that there are contacts there that have been painted or masked over.
Yeah.
There's a lot of potential value here for pushing savings back to the consumer, because when you look at these chiplets, they're actually cheaper to produce, and they can fit a lot more onto a wafer. You know what I mean? So since they're going to be a lot cheaper to produce, they're flexible, in their design, it's easier to get much better silicone because you're using smaller cuts or smaller parts of the fab or whatever. I can't even think, but I don't know. I'm just really stoked. It's a great design. It's a great idea.
One last thing from the AMD keynote. This technically came after, we talked earlier about how Jensen Huang from NVIDIA kind of slammed Radeon 7. And so Lisa Su was interviewed after the keynote, and her response to NVIDIA's slam was this. What I would say is that we're very excited with Radeon 7. I would probably suggest he hasn't seen it yet.
She's so classy. Have you noticed that? She's just very warm and very classy.
She goes on to say, and look, there are 400 million gamers that are using Radeon. We have a pretty big installed base. And when you look at that, much of the conversation you guys have asked me time and time again, what's the next high-end GPU from AMD? In my view of it is, we had to bring Radeon 7 to market. It's important for our fan base and for our high-end gamers.
Mm-hmm.
We think it performs very, very well. And if you look beyond at the memory technology and what we have, I think we feel good about it. And I think you guys will soon see soon enough for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So
once those reviews come out, people will finally realize Vega is not a bad part. I'm pretty sure.
No, I think the problem with original Vega was that it was probably pushed out the door before it was fully ready.
It was. It was. It wasn't fully baked. That and it never hit its MSRP.
Well, cryptocurrency mining did Vega no favors.
This is true.
Because it was such a monster at compute that even at its massively inflated prices, it was worth it for miners.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there was one other little addendum I wanted to talk about.
Really?
It was a little minor thing in the AMD keynote, but it was something interesting that popped up, and that is that all AMD socket AM4 motherboards will soon be able to support PCIe 4.0.
Yay!
Assuming your board manufacturer pushes a BIOS update for it.
Really? That's it?
Well,
would you need the CPU to back it up too?
Well, this is what Tom's Hardware found out from AMD representatives. They said, we spoke with our AMD representatives who confirmed that 300 and 400 series AM4 motherboards can support PCIe 4.0. AMD will not lock out the feature, but instead it will be up to the motherboard vendors to validate and qualify the faster standard on its motherboards on a case-by-case basis. Motherboard vendors that do support the feature will enable it through BIOS updates, but those updates will come at the discretion of the vendor. In other words, because they're looking to support PCIe 4.0 with the Ryzen 3000 line, and it's using socket AM4, which, remember, is going to be supported all the way through 2020, then it looks like 300 and 400 series boards will be able to support Ryzen 3000 and will be able to unlock PCIe 4.0 functionality. Which is a good thing, because the little miscellaneous piece that I wanted to talk about was that Phison demonstrated the world's first PCIe 4.0 SSD at CES 2019. This comes from Tom's Hardware as well. It was Phison's E16 controller, which in this demonstration hit 4 gigabytes per second.
Wow.
They claimed On the demo SSD, a blistering 4 gigabytes per second of sequential read and a beastly 4.2 gigabytes per second of write performance, according to Crystal Benchmark. This particular demo SSD used Micron's 96-layer TLC flash, but they will also hit the market using Toshiba's BiCS4 flash. They expect those that use Toshiba's BiCS4 flash to hit even higher speeds of 4.8 and 4.4 gigabytes per second read and write, respectively.
Well, guys, I can't even stay awake. I'm sorry.
It's okay. We're basically to the end at this point. We do have a couple of hardware deals this week. If you've been interested, if you're still looking for a graphics card and you missed some of those $130, $140 RX 570s and 580s back around Black Friday or the Christmas season, well, take heart. You still have a chance at one, assuming you get it today as you're watching this when it goes live on YouTube. And this is from Newegg. It is an ASRock Phantom Gaming D Radeon RX 570 4 gig for $129.99 with 99-cent shipping. So I will attempt to share this.
That's a heck of a deal.
So ASRock Phantom Gaming D RX 570 4 gig. It does come with the AMD 2 free games deal that we've been talking about for the last month or so. So $130 plus roughly $100 worth of games. It's an RX 570, so it'll perform just fine 1080p high in most games. With maybe a small exception of some AAA titles. And for this one, no fancy promo codes needed. No rebates that you have to fill out. It's just straight up $129.99.
That's a heck of a deal.
And the other deal I found today is the Kingston A400 SSD. You can get the 480 gigabyte version for $65.
Yeah.
And so it's a solid entry-level SSD. It's not the fastest out there. 500 megabytes per second read, 450 megabytes per second write. But it's a basic SATA 3 SSD, 480 gigabytes, 500 gig class SSD for $65.
Not bad.
Yeah.
And so with that, gentlemen, we've reached the end of our CES 2019 recap. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I just want to see video card prices come down to acceptable levels. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wait until maybe the summer before any competition occurs. So, or Pascal finally sells out, and maybe NVIDIA would be nice enough to grace us with better prices on RTX, but doubtful.
One can hope.
And I'm still waiting for, and I'm still waiting for what we'll see from Navi.
Understandable.
Yeah. One thing Lisa Su did say during the keynote was that these were not all the announcements AMD had for this year. There was more stuff on the way.
Oh, there's a ton of more stuff. There's
later in the year.
To expect it mid-2019. So my bet is we will see more announcements right around Computex.
Yeah, it seems to be the way it's going to go. Faux show.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining me this evening.
You're welcome.
And to everyone who's watching this, if you enjoyed this content, of course, you can watch back episodes of TechForge, including our speculation videos, so you can laugh at all the things we got wrong.
Yeah.
as well as all our other great content here on CrossForge Gaming. And so I've been Ned. This has been the TechForge podcast. And remember, when life has you down, Jesus loves you, and forge on.
Yep, forge on.